care then how much I charged you, the people of Corinth and its area. Actually, the city of Corinth wouldn't have been taxed because it was a Roman colony, and one of the benefits of being a Roman colony is that you didn't have to pay taxes, or at least the citizens didn't have to pay taxes. But the people in the outlying villages and towns and farms and everything would pay taxes. And if I'm the tax collector, the way I make a profit is by charging you a lot more than I need just to send to Rome. Romans didn't care about this. They just knew it was going to happen. This is the way they collected their taxes. This is why the word tax collector is such a bad word for everybody but the Romans. Why you'll see in the Gospels the term tax collectors and sinners. Why? Because the Jews didn't like the tax collectors because they were being ripped off by them. Your hand up?
Did Matthew come from a rich background then?
Well, number one, we'll talk about who the historical Matthew is. The figure in Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, we don't know much about his actual history. He just appears. But when it calls him a tax collector, it doesn't necessarily mean that he was the one who owned the right for that whole area. It just means he could have been hired by somebody to sit at a roadside and collect taxes and tolls and stuff. So the word tax collector didn't necessarily mean that the person themselves were wealthy. But whoever had the tax, what's the English word I'm looking for? Franchise. Whoever had the tax franchise for that area would be someone from a wealthy background. But then you'd hire out other people to do the taxes. So these people, of course, were very unpopular. The Romans maintained peace to a great extent by keeping the poor poor. So the Pax Romana may have sounded great if you were an elite, but if you were not in the elite, it may have seemed more oppressive than anything. There were some other benefits, though, that the Romans did. They made travel much easier. Pompey had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, which is something that our governments can't seem to do. They built roads, maintained some communication. They had a mail service, although it was for official use only, but this meant that you could get, at least the Roman officials could get mail delivered fairly quickly. They used even a horseback relay that could go 100 kilometers a day. Soldiers were expected to be able to travel 30 kilometers per day in full pack. And that was only possible because besides using the sea, the shipping lanes for travel, which was much faster than overland travel, the Romans maintained roads. They didn't really care about roads for everybody else. They wanted the roads for their army, just like the U.S. interstate system was originally created for in case the army needed to be moved across the country very quickly if the Soviets attacked. So this is the same way with the Romans. They built roads for the army, but of course other people used the roads too. This was why Christianity and other things were able to spread so easily, why Paul was able to travel around the empire. He would prefer to go by sea if possible because it's much quicker, but at least he could travel on the roads that the Romans built and maintained. As far as religion, Ehrman talks about this in your textbook, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but the common Hollywood idea that the Romans were kind of oppressive of other religions or the Christians is just that, a Hollywood idea. The Romans actually were very tolerant of local religions. They didn't care what gods you worshipped. The Romans were actually very pious in the sense that they believed that whatever land they were in, they should provide sacrifices and honors for the local gods, especially the important ones. So the Romans would honor local gods, other people's gods. Every people was allowed to use their own gods. Jews, for example, since the time of Julius Caesar, who befriended the Jews because they helped him out politically a lot, he gave them certain privileges. Jews didn't have to, they could observe the Sabbath. They didn't have to do things on the Sabbath if they didn't want to. They didn't have to serve in the army. They got to observe their own religions. They weren't expected to sacrifice either to the emperor or to other gods. So the Romans basically were very tolerant. When they weren't tolerant was when some religious group or club started looking like they might be rebellious. If they started looking like insurrection would happen, the Romans didn't do it. So the Romans, for example, outlawed volunteer fire departments in local places because they were afraid that volunteer fire departments could be a place where locals, especially maybe lower class locals, could get together and then start gossiping about what they could do to cause trouble for the Romans. So the Romans were only concerned about religions when it looked like those religions were going to cause political problems. As we'll see next time, Jews fell into the system in many different ways. Sometimes they were relatively happy clients of the Romans. Sometimes they were subversive enemies of the Roman order. As I said, they were officially recognized by the Romans, but this caused problems for Jews sometimes. In Alexandria, the local Egyptian population resented the Jews because they were recognized as a legal ethnicity in Alexandria. And they weren't given complete privileges of the Greeks in Alexandria was a Greek city, so there were Greek-speaking, maybe people of Greek descent, but if they had fully adopted Greek customs, they were considered Greeks. The Jews were not considered Greeks, but at least they were higher in status in Alexandrian law than local Egyptians. The Egyptians were the lowest in the city. So the local Egyptians resented the Jews because the Jews were recognized as their own ethnicity and given some privileges. So this is why you sometimes had Jews getting in trouble with local groups and have violence with Jews in different places. And sure enough, pogroms arise in places. Local people would attack the Jews, or the Jews would try to set up an extra big meeting house for themselves, and it would cause local problems. But these were not problems brought on by the Romans. These were local problems, and part of it was precisely because the Jews had been recognized by the Romans as having a special status in some places, and this caused some kind of local resentment. As we'll see, though, the very fact that the Romans had allowed this one universal empire that had been created by Alexander originally, and with a Greek veneer, and they allowed the West to stay Latin and the East to stay Greek, and they melded these two different things. All of this was one of the reasons that Christianity was able to spread at this time in the way it did. In fact, you might even think that had Jesus come and had Paul lived, had they tried to spread this new group, this new movement, at a time 500 years before this or 500 years afterwards, it may have never happened. Because it was precisely because of this one world that run by the Romans and maintained by the Romans that allowed the spread of Christianity to a great extent, both ideologically and thought-wise, as well as simply physically. Any questions? Okay, time's up. See you not on Monday, but on Wednesday.